One rainy night in the middle of May 2003, my friends and I were hanging out at around 9 p.m. We are the Navajo tribe people, getting water for the livestock in Sunrise, Arizona. We were having a great time. Tony was driving. I was on the passenger seat. John and Cody were sitting in the back seat. We were telling jokes and cracking up. We got to the windmill, and we started the water and waited for it to fill the barrel. We were walking around looking at the local cows, but then the water started to overflow. John ran to pull out the hose. John is a professional sheep herder. Then we all got back into the truck. This time I was going to drive. When I got in the truck, it would not start. I tried to start the truck, and I even looked under the hood to check out if there's anything out of place. Nothing. I went back into the truck. Tony had wanted to go and mess around with the cows, and so did John and Cody. While they were out there, I was trying to figure out what was wrong with the truck. Suddenly, a sound so loud that I jumped up. I thought it was just the guys throwing rocks to scare the cows. So I kept on work and looked for the problem. Then I heard the sound again. I got out of the truck and yelled for the guys to stop doing that. They started to come back. When they got back to the truck, I asked them if they threw rocks to the windmill, and they all said no. That's when I got the chills. Then we went back to where the cows were, and Tony stayed with me this time. Then we heard the sound again, only this time it was harder. Tony yelled to them and told them to stop. There was no answer. Usually they would tell him Zuhia, which is a calm down joke in Navajo language. He called them once more, but no one yelled back. This is when we started to get worried. Really worried. We started walking out into the dark looking for them. We called out their names, but no one answered. We had no flashlights. The only light we had was the moonlight, which kept coming in and out of the clouds. We could barely see where we were even going. After about 10 or so minutes, we finally found them. They were on the ground, almost shivering, and their eyes wide open. Tony and I thought about the worst that could happen. I mean, we have heard stories about these Skinwalkers, or in Navajo, the Yanagulushi. We have experienced encounters before, but not like this, or at least not with us out here in the open. We know what we had to do, but we didn't know if there was only one or a few more. Then we heard some scrambling noise in the bushes nearby. Tony and I were very scared at this point, but when we heard it again, but on our right, and then our left, and then in front of us, and then finally behind us, just made us freak. It all happened in just about 3 or so seconds. The chills literally ran up our back, and I knew Tony always had some Navajo mountain tobacco or blessing cedar to protect us from these skinwalkers, but he didn't have either of them. So, Tony and I made a run back to the truck with half-dead bodies of Cody and John. We heard the footsteps of something running after us. We made it back to the truck and we all got back in, and that's when it went silent. Then the witchcraft that the skinwalkers put on Cody and John wore off. All of a sudden, some sickly-looking coyotes jumped on the hood of the truck. There were 3 creatures that had the body of a coyote, but a little more human-like features. They could walk on all 4 of their legs, or just their 2 back legs. They had eyes that were crystal blood and red. They had the smell of dead animals, and the smell was so unbearable. We all fell back into our seat and started to scream like little girls. They started to sing or chant. We knew they were speaking in Navajo, but we were so terrified that we couldn't tell what they were saying. Then, some tall, long-haired, furry black creature with crystal-like eyes was just outside Tony's window, breathing heavily with the ugliest face we've ever seen. Tony looked right at it and jumped back so fast and powerful that he almost knocked out Cody. The creature blew something like powder through the window and onto us. We all started to slow our breathing and calm down, and after seconds, it was quiet. We started to knock out one by one. Next thing you know, we woke up the next day face down, butt up in Tony's bedroom. We never found out what happened to the Skinwalkers, but we had a series of ceremonies that was to protect us from the sickness that the Skinwalker had placed on us. The medicine man told us that the people who did this to us were after us because of jealousy. They were jealous of us because of all the things we have and all the accomplishments we've done. So, we had their power turned around to backfire on them, and it was supposed to get them back with the witchcraft that they laced onto us. After we had the ceremonies, Tony went back to his house, and his mom said that night we just walked through the door about 1:30 a.m., got a glass of water, and went into my room. She also said we were so quiet she thought we were sleeping. Up to today, we still hang out, but we still get water and take care of the livestock. But we will never forget what happened that night. When I was about 12 years old, I was driving with my father on a road from Window Rock, Arizona, toward I-40 junction near Sanders, Arizona, and this road is located on the Navajo Nation. All the reservation is trees and high desert, and houses aren't found for miles, and there isn't any electricity or running water. My dad and I were driving south, and it was snowing, and it was about 2 a.m. We were driving for roughly 40 minutes from Window Rock, and my dad and I saw a woman beside the road with no shoes and no jacket. When we saw her, she was walking about 25 feet from the road. When we saw her, she didn't even look back to see who it was or even try to hitchhike. She just kept on walking like nothing was wrong. Then my dad says, "Damn, she must be freezing." I started laughing because I thought she was drunk or something. I mean, walking in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Then my dad pulled over for her and she was still walking. So my dad shouted in Navajo and English, "Hey, do you need a ride?" And as soon as my dad yelled, she turned around ever so slowly to look at us, and her long hair was covering her face. You couldn't even see what her face looked like. Her hair just covered her whole head like a mop head. She slowly started walking toward us, stepping on rocks and branches and snow. She walked up to the truck on the passenger side where I was just sitting and just stood by the window for like 15 seconds, just looking at me. My dad said, "Open the door, jump in the back." But as soon as I opened the door, she just took off running away into the dark forest. My dad and I were stunned because it was freezing out there and there wasn't civilization for miles. So I just closed the door and my dad closed the door. We just took off and thought, what the hell is her problem? Because she looked just like a regular person. A couple of weeks go by and my dad was visiting some of his friends who lived within 5 miles of the area, and my father just mentioned what happened to them. And their faces just looked stunned, and they had said, "Was her hair covering her whole head, and did she have any shoes?" And my dad was like, yeah. And then that's when they told him that it wasn't a real lady. She's a ghost. My father and I didn't understand. We were like, what? But she looked like a real person. Well, my father's friends weren't surprised because the Navajos are used to hearing weird stories like that, and of course having weird encounters happening to them all over the reservation. I live in Oklahoma, but I'm from Gallup, New Mexico. My son Anthony and my daughter Alicia had just moved here in from Gallup. They found a house to rent in the same town I live in. So, Anthony and I drove back to Gallup to get their stuff out of storage. It was the beginning of March and it was very windy. We pulled a horse trailer behind the pickup. It was empty on the way there and we can only drive about 45 to 55 miles an hour without the trailer starting to swing all over the road. So, a trip that normally took 11 hours, well, you guessed it, roughly 17 hours. We were traveling on I-40 west of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, there are several different Indian reservations there. It was late at night and Anthony was driving. He needed to go to the bathroom bad. So, he exited at the bottom of 9 Mile Hill, just west of Albuquerque. He drove behind the gas station because it was closed and there were a few semis parked in front. I told him not to stop there because I saw someone by the trash dumpster. He pulled up a little further and we looked back. There was nobody there. I figured that I was just tired and maybe seeing things. He started to get out and I told him to hurry, that something didn't feel right. He agreed. After he got back in the truck, he said it felt like someone was standing behind him while he was pissing. He was afraid to look back, so he just ran fast and jumped in the truck. My son started driving west again on I-40. Maybe 10 more miles down the road, he started slowing down in the middle of the road. There was a vehicle quite a distance in front of us. We could see the brake lights, and the car looked as if it were turned sideways in the middle of the road. I looked at my son and asked him what he was doing. "Hey, do you see that car?" he said. I looked again and it was driving perfectly down the road like it had never stopped. I told my son to pull over to the side of the road. I asked him if he was tired and he replied yes, so we both got out of truck to switch places. I walked around the front of the truck and Anthony walked around the back and stepped over the tongue of the trailer. Right when I was getting in on the driver's side, a car passed by. I glanced at it as it drove by. At the end of the car on the pavement, right by the taillights, was a man. He was hunched over on all fours, feet and hands on the ground. He was covered with a buckskin. It almost looked as if he had jumped off the back of that car right as it passed us. The next second, he was gone. I thought I had to be seeing things. It was late and I was getting really tired. Now, my son got in on the other side and I started driving down the road. I didn't say anything about what I saw, but I glanced in my rearview mirror to see if the trailer was keeping steady. I didn't want it to get out of control. When I glanced back, I noticed something flapping in the wind off the trailer. It looked as if it were the bottom of a jacket or maybe the bottom of the buckskin I saw draped over the man in the road. Then I asked Anthony if he had seen the man in the road behind the car. He said yes and explained to me what he saw. It just so happened it was exactly what I had seen. He then asked me if I had seen a man leaning against the back of the trailer, but I said no, that I hadn't looked in the mirror on that side. Anthony said that when he was getting in on the passenger side, he had glanced at the back of the trailer and saw a man leaning against it. He said his face was hidden, but he could see blue glowing around his face. He described it as the color of the blue that you see when you light up a cell phone. I then told Anthony that there was something on the back of the trailer, or maybe even on the tongue of the trailer. At this point, Anthony eventually fell asleep, but I kept paying attention to the rear view mirror instead of the road. In the mirror, I could see a shadow of 3 stick-like fingers. At one point, I almost missed a curve in the road. It was a good thing that I was driving slowly because there was a good 100-yard drop-off on that curve. We made it to Gallup around 3 or 4 a.m. I woke up my son to go unlock the gate at his dad's house, and when I opened the door, the cab light came on. It was flickering as if someone was moving their hand back and forth underneath it. Anthony saw it too. I lifted the seat to get our stuff out of the back, and I noticed that the seat was down in the extended part of the cab. When we left on our trip, the seat was up and can't be put down unless someone is releasing a lever from both sides of the pickup. I shouted at Anthony to come back to the truck to witness the seat. I kind of felt like I was going crazy. We went in the house and we went to bed. The next day, we loaded up the trailer and drove back to Oklahoma. When it started getting dark, I looked in my rearview mirror and I could see the side of the trailer perfectly from the brake light of the truck. The night before, I couldn't see a brake-like reflection at all. So, whatever was riding with us was on the back of the bumper covering up the taillight. Anthony's theory was that a skinwalker saw us, pulled over on the side of the road and knew we were tired and was going to try to make us wreck. He thinks that the light flickering inside of the pickup and the seat in the back being down was his grandmother that had recently passed away. Anthony was very close to her, and he felt that she was protecting us from the Skinwalker. As a teenager, I would visit my grandmother at her home on the Navajo reservation for several weeks every summer. I loved to spend time with her, eat her delicious fried bread that she made, and hear her tell us stories. Every so often, my grandmother would hire a worker to do odd jobs around her house and property. Well, one evening, right before the sun went down, I was asked by my grandmother to take him home, which was about 4 miles out of the valley where she lived. I was more than happy to, seeing that I was only 14 years old and was asked to drive a truck. Mind you that on the res, nobody cares that you're only 14 years old and driving around. Hell, there's hardly anybody around to see you anyway. So my 9-year-old brother jumped in the truck cab with me while this worker and my dog shared the tailgate of the truck, and, well, we were off. After I dropped the worker off at the shack that he and his brother call the house, we headed back down the road to grandmother's. As I mentioned before, it was evening and the sky was a deep red as the sun began to set behind us. We were leaving a nice dust trail from the dirt road, and the radio was playing music from the only radio station that could be picked up from the nearest town of Holbrook, Arizona. There was nothing unusual, nothing weird. It was at this time that my eye caught movement of something in the bushes a little up the road to the right of us. I remember slowing down, thinking that it was one of the many free-roaming sheep in the area, and they would dart out in front of the truck. As I passed where I thought I saw it, I sped up, thinking nothing else of it. But then, out of nowhere, I just felt this dark feeling of fear and dread. I had no idea why I was feeling this way, but I definitely felt that something was wrong. As I play this memory back in my mind, there are only a few clear memories that I have of that evening. I clearly remember looking in my rearview mirror and seeing the dark silhouette of something very tall and very skinny that seemed to be covered with some kind of hair or fur running behind the truck after us. Whatever it wasn't normal or human at all. I remember hearing my brother crying and my dog barking ferociously at whatever was chasing us. I remember speeding very fast and shaking violently as the truck bounced on the washboard dirt road. I distinctively remember that this thing was only getting closer as my brother cried, "It's coming up on your side!" I remember being as scared as hell and thinking that I didn't want to die. At the moment that I thought would be our last, I remember speeding around a bend in the road and seeing a car coming toward us in the opposite direction. At that moment, I felt instant relief and felt that whatever was following us was now gone. Shaken up, but alive, we made it to grandmother's house, wondering what the hell had just happened. We ran inside, not looking back, hoping that whatever was chasing us had not followed us home. As we told my grandmother about our experience, she didn't seem too surprised, which surprised us. She continued by repeating stories that we had already heard at one point or another about black magic, witches, and something that the Navajos call Yinadlushi, or Skinwalkers. Needless to say, I didn't even want to look out any of the windows at all the rest of the night. And as a matter of fact, I never drove on the reservation at night again until I was 21. Without going too deep into explanation, I'll just say that these skinwalkers are evil men and spirits that use black magic for evil doing. I tell you that as far-fetched as it may sound, they are real. I believe that if God and his greatness are real, then the devil is equally as real and also has his ways of showing himself. This may not sound very scary to some readers, and that may be due to my lack of writing, but what happened that evening really did happen, and it scared the living crap out of me. I invite anybody to visit this part of Arizona if you have any doubt or want a huge scare. I promise you won't be disappointed. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for the larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, which is about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages and suggests they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was the summertime, so Dad decides we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, and then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out the Window Rock, which is, for those who don't know, a big rock face with a large hole in it that goes to the other side. It's pretty cool. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some talkie-talkies so we could communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my father and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left side of the highway, there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right side, there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of this hill, and down at the bottom of the hill, we see what appears to be a very large dog just sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio, "Hey Travis, do you see that big-ass dog?" Travis starts yelling back over the radio, "That is not a dog, speed up right now and hit it." He sounds almost hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it! You have to hit it, please, please, hit that fucking thing right now." So, my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks right at us, and it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually pretty huge. Though it was still sitting on its haunches, it is about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We get literally inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like someone screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leaps backwards, towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then, with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis's comes in over the radio again. "Holy shit, keep driving, we have to get out of here, we have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part, "We have to get out of here, and we have to go faster." Pretty soon, we are speeding like crazy, and just as we start to come near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis says, "We just saw a skinwalker a few miles back, and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things, namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's kind of sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S. largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has on average 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we travel a lot on the Navajo reservation, and we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our big game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving before we had entered the res. And by this time, everyone was asleep with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. But for some reason, I just couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of a pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles an hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, oh my god, it's a Skinwalker. The Skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring right at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The Skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhumane smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked yellow pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up and I was panicking throughout the whole ordeal. The Skinwalker started to crumble down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the Skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing. Turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another Skinwalker since. It might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and the res. And if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around. This all happened about 5 or so years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruins in New Mexico. That was once the seat of the Inquisition. I can't for the life of me remember what the place is called, but anyway. So we jumped the front gate to the palace and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him, and he started playing it, and about 30 seconds into his mediocre playing, something started screaming really, really loud on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quick, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. We noped the fuck out of there, and one of my friends pissed his pants and drove for a few hours to Bandelier National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got to Bandelier at probably like 6 or 7 a.m. and then we set up our camp. After a few hours just talking about what the hell happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss behind it, probably only like 300 feet from our camp. This is where everything starts getting a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming my way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there, and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but to follow them, like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These weren't my friends. They had bright red hair with my friends' faces and cat eyes. Both of these friends were brunette. I stopped walking and they looked at me with probably the most terrifying gaze I've ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I came from. After like 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to that rock that I pissed at and found our camp. Everybody was sitting there, still sitting around, talking, and didn't even notice that I was even gone. I told them what had happened with the look-alike Skinwalkers, and we packed up everything and left probably within like 10 minutes and got the hell back to Albuquerque. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles an hour, give or take 5 miles an hour. I had this awful sense of just being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, which was the passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest and then completely stopped when I heard a tap-tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me, and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." Basically, that's the Navajo to English equivalent of what he had said. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time go by, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he said, "I didn't see faces, just the eyes. Like brake lights you see on the road, it watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter, just a pause from him. "Because it wasn't alone." As many of you might already know, many Navajo people, including my own family, are very reluctant to speak about skinwalkers because it is believed to attract their attention. Well, I, however, grew up away from the Navajo Nation and was very naive about the subject. When it came to skinwalkers, I was an absolute skeptic. My mom used to tell me a story of how back in the 80s, when she lived with her siblings and my grandparents, still in Shiprock, but the southern outskirts, about how she and my aunt saw a skinwalker just outside their driveway under a streetlight. She described it as a black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and these unnatural eyes with a soft, burnt orange glow. Me, being my own closed-minded self, doubted every word, but I never said my doubts aloud. But these doubts totally changed last year when I went to my grandparents' house last October. Me and my family had just finished scourging the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair and called it a night. The house was close enough where we could walk home in just 10 minutes, so we did. When we got there, it was about 9 at night, where we stayed up until about 2, catching up about family affairs and the local news. It was during that time that I had just decidedly opened my mouth and blurted out the question, "Hey, are skinwalkers real? Guys?" I asked. "You shouldn't be speaking about that," my grandma said with almost a disturbed yell in her voice, so she and my grandfather both decide to go to bed. After being scolded by my mom, one of my aunts chimes in with a very cautious tone and says, "They're real, all right. Had a few start screaming outside of my trailer in Farmington just a few nights ago. Your cousin had nightmares the whole night and woke up crying that morning." Not wanting to push the discomfort any further, we all decided to go to bed at this point. Now, the trailer/home is pretty old and it was a really nice night, So we slept with the windows open, the screens to prevent bugs coming in, of course. Everyone at this point had drifted off to sleep except me. Well, because my mind was still just going a million miles a minute about skinwalkers and wondered if I ever encounter one while here on the reservation. As a kid, I was told it's taboo to think about skinwalkers because it can still call their attention. That's when shit totally hit the fan for me. Just as I was settling and finally getting relaxed for sleep, I started to hear something moving outside. I get up from the couch and start wandering over to the kitchen window. In the trailer, all of the rooms have the lights out, so the only visible light that can be seen is from the porch light out front. I was thankful for this because I told myself if it really was a skinwalker outside, then hopefully it wouldn't notice me seeing it. So I muster up the courage and take a quick scan of outside. From the porch light, all I can see is the dusty ground and the vehicles that my family drove along with some of the old metal trash cans that stood beside the road. Looking for about a good 5 seconds, I wasn't able to see anything, so I was getting ready to turn around and walk back to bed, thinking it was just a stray cat or something. Only have taken 2 steps. I hear what sounds like a distorted scream coming from outside, definitely close by. The fear rising in me, I look outside again, and there I see it for the first time. A coyote-like figure was staring at my direction from behind the cars, just outside of the reach of the porch light. Only it looked awfully wrong and gave off an evil vibe just from seeing it. It was gray with very disheveled hair, and a horrific orange-red soft glow came from its eyes. I noped the hell out and ran back to the bedroom. It was at this moment I had begun to also notice an awful stench in the air that smelled kind of like rotting meat. I started trying to wake up my mother, who was like, "Oh my God, it's almost 3 a.m., what do you want?" I immediately began in a shaken voice, "There's something scary outside." And then she said, now annoyed because I woke her up, "Ugh, it's probably just a stray animal or something. It's the res. Animals wander all the time at night." She obviously wasn't getting the drift of what I was saying, so I screamed, "There's some Blair Witch Project shit going on outside, Ma." Well, that got her attention. What are you talking about?" she said, and then we heard it. The thing outside started making more of its dreadful like screams and started what sounded like thrashing outside on the ground. Hear that? That's what I'm talking about. So both her and I got back up and looked outside the window, and the coyote thing was making its way to the door. It walked with an odd limp and dragged its back right leg as if it was a handicap. We could hear it start to scratch against the door and make this odd, muffled moaning sound. My mom went and got my dad, and they both started shouting in Navajo all sorts of words, telling the thing to go away and saying it's not welcome here. Well, all this commotion was enough to get the rest of the trailer up as they came out into the hallway. The only thing my mom did was turn to them and said, "Skinwalker," while proceeding to point to the door, while the noises were still happening. Apparently, they already knew exactly what to do as my grandfather got out a handgun from the drawer and a bag of ashes. He coated a few bullets and loaded them into the gun and went straight to the door. Yelling out more Navajo that was too fast for me to even comprehend, he swung open the door and fired twice. Nothing. The thing managed to escape before my grandpa could even put a bullet in it. "That's the fastest one I've ever seen," said my grandpa. Next thing you know, my aunts and my parents are freaking out about what had just happened, saying stuff like, "What if it comes back tomorrow?" And "It saw us, does that mean we're targets now?" Afterwards, my grandparents calmed everyone down, myself included, saying that we'll be fine, and we all went to bed about 3-ish. Morning comes, and my grandparents call one of their neighbors and explain to them what had happened. Apparently, one of them was a medicine man who used to partake in Navajo ceremonies used for healing and curing sickness, and came over to bless each family member and the grounds outside. This is my father's story, written from his perspective. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and stone. a lot like our house now. It was 2 of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to Jimmy's Fest and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than just coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to go to sleep for a few hours. But then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, save for my brother snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse, and the dogs began with their crazed barking in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first, and I waited outside for him. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs, and then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year, to be honest. Not even the sheep were making any noises. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck, and when I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little, and then suddenly kicking one of them. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, 2 burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk toward me with a long stride, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was even going on. I also noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and he smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The Skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally, noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm outward toward my brother's head. And something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the Skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angry at the thing that was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more that smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile now long gone since what had happened. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. Whenever my mom would take us on a road trip to her hometown on the Navajo reservation, I'd occasionally ask her to tell me a Skinwalker story along the way. I remember every story she's told me when we were driving through miles of nothing at night. Luckily, nothing ever happened to us during those drives. Anyway, this is one of those stories, and it came from my auntie. So my auntie and some of her friends used to party a lot back in the day. They'd hop up in a beaten-down van and drive out to the boondocks and just drink and have fun. Of course, this all took place on the Navajo reservation after sunset, and on this particular night, that's what they were doing. Everything was going good and whatnot when all of a sudden, they hear what sounds like rocks being thrown at their van. Everybody gets quiet as they wonder what the hell is going on. The sounds of rocks being thrown stops, and then suddenly, something jumps on top of the van roof. I should mention my family owned a white van that we would use for road trips because it had enough room for all of my brothers and me. So imagine a young me being told this story in a van. Terrifying. Everybody starts panicking as the realization sets in and hurry to lock every door. My auntie jumps in the driver's seat and tries to start the engine, but of course, the beaten down van refuses to start up. Whatever is on the roof is still up there making banging noises, and at this point, like it's jumping up and down. My auntie is freaking out when she then sees a hand with long nails reach over the roof and start scratching the windshield. At this point in the story, my mom would take one hand off the steering wheel and scratch the windshield to simulate it. Then, whatever was on the roof jumps off. Everyone is still freaking out, yelling at my auntie to start the van, and she keeps trying. And that's when she sees the Skinwalker walk up to the driver's side window and stare at her just a few inches away. Well, that's when my auntie jumped in the back and started praying for her life. Minutes pass and the Skinwalker appears to leave. My auntie hops back in the driver's seat and gets the van to start, and off they go. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, though, opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure just drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off of the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were luckily returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun, and my grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed a ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandmother chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after this thing, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on the particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. But not only that, but whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days had passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is and say their name, it will kill them.